Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
Imagine checking your credit score one day and finding a massive loan you didn't take out, and learning your parents are behind it. What would you do? Betrayed by the people who should protect you most, I had to make an unthinkable choice that tore my family apart and left me questioning everything. It started like any other day. I had just finished paying my bills online and decided to do a routine credit check. I'd always been cautious with my finances, making sure my credit score stayed in good standing. It was something I prided myself on, a small, steady accomplishment in the chaos of adulthood. But when I logged into my account, my stomach dropped. My score had plummeted by over 100 points since my last check. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. How could this happen? I paid my bills on time. I didn't have any outstanding debt, or so I thought. Panic set in as I scrolled through the report, searching for the source of the problem. And then I saw it. A loan for $30,000 taken out under my name. My heart sank. The words blurred on the screen as disbelief washed over me. I hadn't taken out a loan. I didn't even need one. For a moment, I thought it had to be a mistake, a clerical error, or maybe even a scam. But as I dug deeper, that hope quickly faded. The loan wasn't new. It had been taken out months ago, and payments were already overdue. My chest tightened as I realized the gravity of the situation. I spent hours on the phone with the bank, desperate to get answers. The representative on the other end was polite but firm. The loan was legitimate, taken out with my social security number and personal information. "Are you sure you didn't authorize this?" she asked, her tone careful, as if she didn't want to accuse me outright. "I'm positive," I replied, my voice shaking. "This has to be fraud." She explained that the next step would be to open an investigation, which would require me to file a police report. But as the conversation continued, more details emerged, details that made my stomach churn. The application for the loan had been completed in person at a local branch. And the name listed on the paperwork? My parents. I felt like the wind had been knocked out of me. "That can't be right," I stammered, though deep down, I already knew it was. My parents had access to my social security number. They were the only ones who could have done this. The representative offered to send me copies of the paperwork, and when the email came through, I opened it with trembling hands. There it was in black and white, my parents' signatures next to mine, forged in a way that was almost convincing. Almost. I sat there in stunned silence, the weight of betrayal sinking in. My parents had always struggled with money, but I never imagined they would do something like this. Growing up, they had instilled in me the importance of responsibility and trust, yet here they were breaking both. By the time I closed my laptop, anger had begun to bubble beneath the surface. How could they do this to me? Why hadn't they told me? And most importantly, how was I supposed to fix this mess? I paced the room, replaying every interaction I'd had with them over the past few months. Had there been signs I missed? Hints of financial trouble that they had tried to hide? My mind raced with questions, but one thing was clear. I needed answers, and I needed them now. The betrayal stung in a way I couldn't quite put into words. These were the people who had raised me, who had taught me right from wrong. Yet they had gone behind my back and jeopardized my future without even asking for my consent. As the initial shock wore off, determination took its place. I wasn't going to let this slide. I deserved an explanation, and more importantly, I deserved justice. I grabbed my keys and headed out the door, my heart pounding in my chest. The drive to my parents' house was a blur, my thoughts swirling with anger, confusion, and a gnawing sense of dread. Whatever their reasons, whatever excuses they had, I knew one thing for sure. Nothing would ever be the same after this conversation. The drive to my parents' house was a blur of anger and disbelief. The betrayal hit me in waves, each stronger than the last. I replayed the bank representative's words over and over in my head, hoping I had misunderstood. But the documents didn't lie, and neither did the pit in my stomach. My parents, the people I had trusted most, had taken out a massive loan in my name and left me to deal with the fallout. By the time I pulled into their driveway, my hands were shaking and my pulse was racing. I didn't even bother knocking. I walked straight in, the doors swinging open with a force that startled my mom, who was sitting on the couch. My dad was in the kitchen, holding a mug of coffee, and both of them froze when they saw the look on my face. "Did you take out a loan in my name?" I asked, my voice trembling with barely contained anger. They exchanged nervous glances, their expressions a mixture of guilt and hesitation. That single look told me everything I needed to know. My dad was the first to speak. "We were going to tell you," he said quickly, setting his mug down on the counter. His tone was defensive, as if trying to preempt the storm he knew was coming. When? I shot back, my voice rising. When my credit score was completely destroyed. When the bank came after me for payments I didn't even know about. We had no choice, my mom said, her voice trembling. She looked down at her hands, avoiding my eyes. We were behind on the mortgage. The bank was threatening to foreclose. We didn't know what else to do. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. So you thought the solution was to steal from me? I asked, my voice breaking. To risk my future without even asking me? It wasn't stealing, my dad interjected, his tone growing sharper. We're your parents. We raised you. We've always put you first. We just needed your help this time. Help? I repeated, incredulous. This isn't help. This is fraud. You forged my signature and put me on the hook for $30,000. Do you even understand what you've done to me? My mom started to cry, and for a moment, I felt a flicker of guilt. But it was quickly overshadowed by the weight of their betrayal. We planned to pay it back before you found out, she said through her tears. It was supposed to be temporary. We just ran out of time. Their excuses only fueled my anger. Temporary? I snapped. Do you know how long it's going to take me to fix this? My credit is ruined. The loan is in default. I can't even begin to deal with this because you didn't have the decency to tell me what was going on. We were trying to protect you, my dad said, his voice firm but unconvincing. You wouldn't have understood how desperate we were. You're right, I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm. I don't understand. Because instead of coming to me and explaining the situation, you lied. You stole my identity and left me to deal with the consequences. That's not protecting me. That's betraying me. My mom reached for my hand, her eyes pleading. We're sorry, she said. We never meant to hurt you. We just didn't know what else to do. I pulled my hand away, the gesture feeling too little too late. You should have talked to me, I said, my voice quieter now, but no less firm. You should have trusted me to help you in a way that didn't destroy my life in the process. The room fell silent, the weight of my words hanging heavily in the air. My parents looked at each other, their guilt now impossible to ignore. For the first time, I saw them not as the infallible figures I had looked up to my whole life, but as flawed, desperate people who had made a terrible decision. I need to fix this, I said finally, my voice steady but cold. But make no mistake, this is on you. You're the ones who did this, and you're the ones who are going to deal with the consequences. My dad's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. My mom looked down, tears streaming silently down her face. I wanted to feel sorry for them, but all I could feel was the weight of what they had done to me. As I turned to leave, my dad called after me. We'll figure it out, he said, his voice strained. We'll make this right. I paused in the doorway, my back to them. You should have thought about that before you took out the loan, I said without turning around. The drive home was a blur, my mind racing with emotions I couldn't fully process. Anger, betrayal, sadness. It all swirled together, leaving me drained and unsure of what to do next. The people who were supposed to protect me had put me in a position I didn't deserve, and now it was up to me to pick up the pieces. One thing was certain. I wasn't going to let this slide. My parents might have made a mess of things, but I was determined to take control of my own future, even if it meant making a choice that would tear our family apart. In the days following the confrontation, I couldn't stop replaying the conversation with my parents in my head. Their apologies, their justifications, it all felt hollow, like a weak patch over a gaping wound. I wanted to believe they had acted out of desperation, but the more I thought about it, the less their story made sense. At first, they stuck to their claim that the loan was for the mortgage. We were months behind, my mom said during one of our strained phone calls. The bank was threatening to take the house. What were we supposed to do? But something about the numbers didn't add up. $30,000 seemed like an awfully large amount for a mortgage payment. And if that had been their only concern, why were the payments already in default? The questions gnawed at me until I decided to dig deeper. I started by pulling up records of the loan and cross-referencing the details with what I knew about their finances. As I pored over the information, a different picture began to emerge, one that had nothing to do with saving the house. It turned out that only a portion of the loan had gone toward the mortgage. The rest had been used to pay off credit card debt, medical bills, and even a few personal expenses like home improvements and a new flat-screen TV. The more I uncovered, the angrier I became. They hadn't just jeopardized my credit to save the family home. They had used me to clean up years of bad financial decisions. When I confronted them about it, their response was as frustrating as it was predictable. We were desperate, my dad said, his tone defensive. You have no idea what it's like to be in our shoes. We did what we had to do. What you had to do. I shot back, my voice trembling with anger. You're telling me you had to buy a new TV? You had to max out your credit cards and then use my name to pay them off. That wasn't desperation. That was irresponsibility. My dad's face darkened, and for a moment, I thought he might lash out. But instead, he folded his arms and looked away, his jaw tight. It's easy for you to judge, he said. You've never had to worry about keeping a roof over your head or food on the table. We did this for the family. For the family? I repeated, incredulous. If you cared about the family, you wouldn't have risked my future without even telling me. You wouldn't have lied to my face. My mom, who had been silent up until now, tried to mediate. We thought we could fix it before you found out, she said, her voice shaky. We didn't mean for things to get this far. I turned to her, my frustration boiling over. That's not good enough, I said. You didn't mean for things to get this far, but they did. And now I'm the one dealing with the consequences. The room fell silent, the weight of my words settling over us like a heavy blanket. My parents exchanged uneasy glances, but neither of them offered a real solution. It was clear that they didn't have a plan, just excuses and vague promises that everything would somehow work out. The betrayal cut deeper than I could have imagined. These were the people who had taught me the value of hard work and responsibility, who had always stressed the importance of doing the right thing. And yet, they had gone behind my back and done something that went against everything they had ever preached. The worst part was the growing realization that this wasn't just a one-time mistake. It was the result of years of poor decisions. My parents had been living beyond their means for as long as I could remember, always chasing the next big purchase or taking on more debt to cover their overspending. I had seen the signs before, but had never thought it would come to this. As the days went on, I tried to have more conversations with them, hoping to get some clarity or at least some accountability. But every time I brought up the inconsistencies in their story, they got defensive. You don't understand what it's like, my dad said during one particularly heated argument. We didn't have the same opportunities you've had. And whose fault is that? I countered, my voice trembling. I've worked hard to build a stable life, and now you're punishing me for it. Do you have any idea what you've done to me? My mom started to cry, and for a moment, I felt a flicker of guilt. But then I remembered the late payment notice from the bank, the damage to my credit score, and the overwhelming sense of betrayal that had settled in my chest. Their tears didn't change what they had done, or the fact that they were still refusing to take full responsibility. By the end of the week, I knew I couldn't rely on them to fix this mess. They had already shown me where their priorities lay, and it wasn't with protecting me or my future. If I wanted to get out of this, I would have to take matters into my own hands. I didn't know exactly what my next steps would be, but one thing was clear. I couldn't trust them anymore. Their lies and excuses had shattered whatever faith I had left in them, leaving me with the painful realization that the people I had always looked up to weren't the heroes I had once believed them to be. As the days stretched into weeks, the weight of the situation began to suffocate me. Every morning, I woke up with a pit in my stomach, dreading the emails and phone calls that inevitably came from the bank. They wanted their money, and they didn't care who was at fault. To them, I was just another account holder who wasn't meeting their obligations. The monthly payments loomed over me like a dark cloud, impossible to ignore. I had my own bills to pay, rent, utilities, groceries, and there was no room in my budget for a loan I hadn't even agreed to. My parents, despite their promises, weren't doing much to ease the burden. Every time I tried to discuss a repayment plan with them, I was met with the same vague reassurances. We're working on it, my mom would say, her voice tinged with frustration. You just need to be patient. Patient? I asked during one particularly tense conversation. Mom, the bank isn't patient. They're sending me notices. They're calling me every day. My credit score is dropping, and I'm the one who has to deal with it. She sighed, as if I were the one being unreasonable. We're doing the best we can, she repeated. But their actions didn't match their words. Instead of making consistent payments, they seemed to be floundering, juggling other debts, and barely staying afloat. I could see the panic in their eyes whenever I brought it up, but it was clear they didn't have a real plan. My dad, who had been relatively quiet throughout the ordeal, finally spoke up during one of these discussions. We're trying to fix it, he said curtly. But you have to understand, we're under a lot of pressure right now. And I'm not. I shot back, my voice trembling with frustration. You're not the ones getting calls from the bank. You're not the ones watching your credit score plummet because of something you didn't do. I can't just sit back and wait for you to figure this out. The tension in the room was palpable. My dad looked away, his jaw tight, while my mom fidgeted with her hands. Neither of them had an answer, and their silence spoke volumes. The tipping point came a few days later when I opened my mailbox and found a notice from the bank. The loan was officially in default, and the tone of the letter was far less forgiving than previous communications. They were demanding immediate action, threatening legal consequences if payments weren't made soon. I stared at the letter, my hands trembling. My credit score, which I had worked so hard to build, was now in free fall. Every late payment, every missed deadline, was a black mark on my record. The loan was no longer just an inconvenience. It was a financial disaster that would take years to recover from. I called my parents that evening, desperate for some kind of solution. "The loan is in default," I said, my voice cracking. "Do you understand what that means? This isn't just about money anymore. It's about my future." "We'll figure it out," my mom said, her tone weary. "When?" I demanded. "Because I can't wait for you to figure it out. I'm the one taking the hit for this, and I don't see you doing anything to fix it." My dad's frustration boiled over. "What do you want us to do?" he snapped. "We don't have the money, okay? We're doing the best we can." His words hit me like a slap in the face. It was the first time he had admitted just how dire their situation was. But instead of offering solutions, he had turned the blame back on me. For a moment, I was too stunned to speak. And then, something inside me snapped. "If you can't fix this, then I will," I said, my voice cold and steady. "But don't expect me to protect you from the consequences." My mom's eyes widened in alarm. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I'm done waiting," I replied. "I've given you every chance to make this right, and you've done nothing but make excuses. If you're not going to take responsibility, then I'll have to go to the authorities." The room fell silent, the weight of my words hanging heavily in the air. My parents looked at me as if I had just threatened to tear the family apart, which in a way I had. But I didn't care anymore. I couldn't keep sacrificing my own future to protect them from the fallout of their actions. That night, I sat at my desk, staring at the pile of paperwork the bank had sent me. Every fiber of my being wanted to believe there was another way, some solution that wouldn't involve taking such drastic measures. But deep down, I knew the truth. My parents weren't going to fix this. They had made their choice, and now it was time for me to make mine. With a heavy heart, I picked up the phone and dialed the number for the local police department. It was the hardest call I'd ever made, but as I explained the situation to the officer on the other end, a sense of clarity washed over me. This wasn't about revenge, it was about protecting myself. And if my parents couldn't see that, then so be it. The decision to report my parents was not one I made lightly. For days, I wrestled with the implications of what I was about to do. On one hand, they were my parents, the people who had raised me, who had cared for me when I was sick, who had taught me to ride a bike and tie my shoes. On the other hand, they had betrayed me in a way I never thought possible. Each time I tried to rationalize their actions, the reality of what they had done would come crashing down on me. They had stolen my identity, jeopardized my financial future, and left me to pick up the pieces, all without a shred of remorse. Loyalty could only stretch so far, and I had reached my limit. Ultimately, it came down to one simple truth. If I let this go unchecked, I would be enabling them. I would be telling them that it was okay to prioritize their own needs at my expense. And I couldn't do that. Not for them. Not for anyone. The morning I filed the police report, I felt like I was moving through a dream. The small office at the station was cold and sterile, the fluorescent lights casting an unflattering glow on everything. The officer who took my statement was patient and kind, but there was no hiding the shock on his face as I explained what had happened. "You're saying your parents took out the loan in your name without your permission?" he asked, his pen hovering over his notepad. "Yes," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "They forged my signature and used my social security number. I had no idea until I checked my credit report." He nodded, jotting down notes. "Do you have any documentation to support this? Emails, bank statements, anything like that?" I handed him a folder containing everything I had gathered. Copies of the loan agreement, correspondence from the bank, even a screenshot of my plummeting credit score. As he flipped through the pages, I felt a strange mix of shame and relief. Shame for having to air my family's dirty laundry to a stranger, and relief that someone was finally taking this seriously. When the officer looked up, his expression was sympathetic. "This is a tough situation," he said, "but you're doing the right thing by coming forward. Identity theft is a serious crime, no matter who's responsible." His words gave me a small measure of comfort, but they didn't make the process any easier. The surrealness of it all hit me in waves, sitting there, recounting every detail of my parents' betrayal to someone who didn't know me, didn't know them, didn't know the tangled web of emotions I was trying to navigate. The fallout was swift and brutal. When my parents found out what I had done, their reactions were exactly what I feared. My mom called me in tears, her voice cracking as she begged me to drop the charges. "We're your parents," she sobbed. "We made a mistake, but you don't have to do this. Please, don't ruin our lives over this." I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to stay calm. "You ruined my life first," I said, my voice trembling. "I gave you every chance to fix this, and you didn't. This isn't about ruining your lives. It's about protecting mine." Her sobs turned into pleas, each one more desperate than the last. "We'll pay it back," she promised. "We'll make it right. Just give us more time." "You've had time," I replied, tears stinging my eyes. "And all you've done is make excuses. I can't do this anymore." My dad's reaction was the opposite of hers, cold, angry, and laced with bitterness. When he called me, it wasn't to apologize or ask for forgiveness. It was to accuse. "How could you do this to us?" he demanded, his voice low and venomous. "After everything we've done for you, this is how you repay us? By turning on your own family?" I felt a surge of anger rise in my chest. "Turning on my family?" I repeated. "You're the ones who stole from me. You're the ones who lied to me. Don't you dare try to make this about loyalty when you're the ones who broke it first." "You're being selfish," he snapped. "You think this is just about you? We were trying to save the family, to keep everything from falling apart. And now you've made it worse." His words stung, but they didn't shake my resolve. "No," I said firmly. "You made it worse. You made the choice to take out that loan. You made the choice to lie. And now, you're dealing with the consequences. Don't put this on me." By the time I hung up, my hands were shaking and my heart was pounding in my chest. I knew I had done the right thing, but that didn't make it any less painful. My parents' refusal to take responsibility only deepened the rift between us, and I wondered if our relationship would ever recover. In the days that followed, I tried to focus on the practicalities, working with the bank, gathering more evidence for the case, and trying to minimize the damage to my credit. But the emotional toll was harder to manage. Every time my phone buzzed with a call or text from my parents, I felt a fresh wave of guilt, anger, and sadness. Still, in my heart, I knew I had made the right choice. Reporting them wasn't about punishing them. It was about standing up for myself, about refusing to let their actions define my future. And if they couldn't see that, then that was their problem, not mine. The legal process began with a cold finality that left me feeling both numb and resolute. My parents were officially charged with identity theft and fraud, and as much as I hated seeing their names in the court documents, I knew there was no other way. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about making sure they were held accountable for their actions. The first hearing was surreal. Sitting in the courtroom, I couldn't shake the feeling that I didn't belong there. Courtrooms were for criminals and strangers, not families. But as the judge read out the charges, the weight of the situation settled heavily on my shoulders. This was real. There was no turning back now. Their lawyer wasted no time trying to spin the narrative. "This is a family matter," he argued during the preliminary hearing. "It doesn't belong in court." My clients acted out of desperation, not malice. Desperation. That word had been their shield from the very beginning, a convenient excuse to justify their actions. But no amount of desperation could change the facts. The bank had detailed records of the loan application, including the forged signatures and the IP address used to submit the documents. The paper trail was damning, and no amount of legal maneuvering could erase it. As the trial progressed, I found myself torn between conflicting emotions. On one hand, I felt vindicated as the evidence piled up. The bank representatives testified about the loan, confirming that my social security number had been used without authorization. Copies of the forged documents were presented, each one a stark reminder of the betrayal I had endured. But on the other hand, watching my parents sit at the defendant's table was gut-wrenching. They looked smaller somehow, their usual confidence replaced by a quiet desperation that made my heart ache. Despite everything, they were still my parents, and seeing them like that felt like a wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. Their defense strategy was as predictable as it was frustrating. Instead of taking responsibility, they painted themselves as victims of circumstance, claiming they had been forced into a corner with no other options. "We were trying to save our home," my dad said during his testimony, his voice steady but defensive. "We didn't want to hurt anyone, least of all our daughter. We just didn't know what else to do." I sat in the gallery, my hands clenched in a fist as I listened to him rewrite the narrative. There was no mention of the credit card debt or the frivolous purchases. No acknowledgement of the choices that had led them to this point. Instead, they framed themselves as loving parents who had made a mistake out of love. But love didn't forge my signature. Love didn't leave me to deal with the fallout of their actions. And love certainly didn't refuse to apologize or take responsibility when given the chance. The prosecution dismantled their defense piece by piece, presenting evidence that contradicted their claims. The loan wasn't just for the mortgage. It had been used to pay off credit cards, buy new appliances, and cover other personal expenses. The image they were trying to project in court didn't match the reality of their actions. Each day in court felt like a battle, not just between the lawyers, but within myself. Part of me wanted to walk away, to let the legal system handle everything and spare myself the emotional toll. But another part of me knew I had to see it through. There was one moment that stood out above all others, a moment that solidified my resolve. It happened during cross-examination, when the prosecutor asked my dad if he regretted what he had done. "I regret that it came to this," he said, his tone carefully measured. The prosecutor pressed further. "Do you regret taking out the loan without your daughter's consent?" My dad hesitated, glancing at his lawyer before answering. "I regret that we couldn't handle it differently," he said finally. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't accountability. It was yet another deflection, another attempt to shift the blame onto the situation rather than their own choices. Sitting in that courtroom, hearing those words, I felt a surge of clarity. This wasn't just about a loan or a credit score. It was about standing up for myself in the face of people who had refused to do the same. My parents might never understand the depth of their betrayal, but I couldn't let that stop me from protecting my future. The trial dragged on for weeks, each day chipping away at whatever fragile sense of normalcy I had left. Friends and co-workers tried to offer support, but there was only so much they could do. This was a battle I had to fight on my own, and the weight of it was exhausting. By the time the closing arguments were made, I felt like I had aged a decade. The prosecution painted a clear picture of what had happened. Parents who had knowingly stolen their daughter's identity to cover up years of financial mismanagement. The defense, meanwhile, stuck to their narrative of desperation and family loyalty, hoping to appeal to the jury's emotions. As I sat there, waiting for the verdict, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. No matter what the jury decided, I knew I had done everything I could to stand up for myself. This wasn't about punishment or revenge. It was about accountability and taking back control of my life. When the verdict finally came, I felt a mix of relief and sadness. My parents were found guilty of fraud and ordered to pay restitution. Watching them react to the decision was painful, but it was a necessary step toward closure. The legal battle was over, but the emotional scars remained. I didn't know what the future held for my relationship with my parents, but one thing was certain. I wasn't going to let their mistakes define me anymore. The verdict wasn't just the end of a legal battle. It was the beginning of a deeper, more personal conflict that rippled through my family like a stone thrown into still water. The rift it created seemed impossible to bridge, with relatives taking sides in a way that made me feel like I was standing in the middle of a battlefield. Some family members were quick to defend my parents. They were just trying to keep the family afloat, my aunt said during a tense phone call. You didn't have to involve the authorities. That was a step too far. It wasn't just a mistake, I replied, my voice strained. It was identity theft, fraud. They put my future at risk, and I couldn't just let it go. Others supported me, though their encouragement came with its own complications. My cousin Sarah, who had always been the blunt one in the family, didn't hold back. Good for you, she said over coffee one afternoon. They needed a wake-up call. You can't just sweep something like this under the rug. Her words felt validating, but they also deepened the divide. Every family gathering became an emotional minefield, with whispered conversations and lingering resentment hanging in the air. I could feel the tension whenever I walked into a room, the weight of unspoken judgments pressing down on me. My siblings were caught in the middle, unsure of how to navigate the growing tension. My younger brother, Jake, was especially conflicted. I get why you did what you did, he told me one night, his voice heavy with hesitation. But Mom and Dad, they're struggling. This whole thing has really messed them up. I didn't mess them up, I said, my frustration bubbling to the surface. They made their own choices, Jake. I'm just dealing with the consequences they left me with. Jake nodded, but I could see the conflict in his eyes. He wanted to support me, but he also couldn't bring himself to fully condemn our parents. His loyalty was torn, and it hurt to see him stuck in that position. The hardest conversations, though, were with my grandparents. They were heartbroken, pleading with me to forgive my parents and let it go. They made a mistake, my grandmother said, her voice trembling as she clutched my hand. But they're still your parents. Families are supposed to stick together, no matter what. Hearing those words stung, but I held my ground. I'm not doing this to punish them, I said gently. I'm doing it because I have to protect myself. Forgiveness doesn't mean ignoring what they did. My grandfather, who had been silent for most of the conversation, finally spoke up. You're right, he said, his tone measured. What they did was wrong, and they need to take responsibility. But don't let this tear the family apart. Find a way to move forward, even if it's not perfect. His words stayed with me, a quiet reminder that there was still hope for healing, even in the midst of so much pain. But for now, the wounds were too fresh, and the emotions too raw, to imagine what that healing might look like. As the weeks went on, the divide in the family only grew wider. My parents, now dealing with the fallout of the trial, became more distant. My mom stopped calling as often, and when she did, her tone was filled with resentment. I hope you're happy, she said during one particularly icy conversation. You've made your point. My dad, meanwhile, refused to speak to me at all. The silence between us was deafening, a constant reminder of how much damage had been done. I tried to focus on rebuilding my own life, but the weight of the family conflict was impossible to ignore. Every phone call, every text message, every holiday gathering felt like a reminder of how much had been lost. One evening, as I sat with Luke and recounted the latest family drama, he put his arm around me and said something that finally gave me a sense of clarity. You did what you had to do, he said. And anyone who really loves you will understand that. If they don't, that's on them, not you. His words were a lifeline, pulling me out of the endless cycle of guilt and second-guessing. I couldn't control how my family chose to react, but I could control how I responded. In the end, I realized that the fallout wasn't just about the trial. It was about the cracks in our family that had been there all along, hidden beneath the surface until the situation brought them to light. My parents' actions had forced us all to confront uncomfortable truths, and while it was painful, it was also necessary. The rift in the family might never fully heal, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to let their choices define me. I had done what I needed to do, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of peace knowing that I had stood up for myself, even when it wasn't easy. After months of hearings, tense conversations, and sleepless nights, the case finally reached its conclusion. The court ruled that my parents were guilty of identity theft and fraud, but instead of sentencing them to jail time, the judge ordered them to pay restitution and attend mandatory financial counseling. It wasn't the outcome I had envisioned. A part of me had wanted more, something that would force them to confront the weight of what they'd done. But I also knew that this resolution was better than nothing. At least they were being held accountable, even if it wasn't in the way I had imagined. The restitution order required them to pay back every penny of the loan, including any fees and penalties accrued along the way. They had 5 years to do it, with monthly payments that would be closely monitored by the court. Knowing they couldn't avoid the consequences this time gave me a small sense of closure, though it didn't erase the pain of their betrayal. The financial counseling component was a surprising twist, one that gave me a sliver of hope. The judge had emphasized that their actions were not just a legal violation, but a symptom of deeper financial irresponsibility. The counseling sessions were meant to teach them better money management skills and help them avoid similar mistakes in the future. As for me, the settlement included an agreement with the bank to remove the fraudulent loan from my credit report. When I received the confirmation letter, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. My credit score, which had been battered by the ordeal, began to recover. It was a small victory, but it symbolized something bigger, a step toward reclaiming the life I had worked so hard to build. Despite these legal and financial resolutions, my parents' attitude remained unchanged. They were bitter, angry, and unwilling to take full responsibility for what had happened. Every conversation with them was laced with resentment, their words sharp and accusatory. "This is all your fault," my dad said during one particularly tense phone call. "You didn't have to drag us through the courts. You could have handled this privately, like a family." His words stung, but they no longer had the power to shake me. "I tried to handle it privately," I replied calmly. "But you refused to listen. You left me with no other choice." My mom, who had always been more emotional, took a different approach. "We're doing everything the court asked," she said during another conversation, her voice trembling. "Isn't that enough? Why can't you just forgive us and move on?" Forgiveness. The word hung in the air like an unspoken challenge. I wanted to forgive them, but forgiveness didn't mean pretending that nothing had happened. It didn't mean ignoring the damage they had done or allowing them to deflect blame. I'm trying to move on, I told her. But moving on doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't mean acting like everything is okay when it isn't. Her silence on the other end of the line spoke volumes. In the weeks that followed, I began to distance myself from the constant back and forth with my parents. I needed time to heal, to focus on rebuilding my life without the shadow of their actions hanging over me. Luke was a steady source of support, always reminding me that I had done the right thing. You can't control how they react, he said one evening as we sat on the couch, the weight of the day's events pressing down on me. But you can control how you let it affect you. You've done everything you could to set things right. His words became a mantra, a reminder to let go of the guilt and focus on what I could control. Slowly but surely, I began to rebuild. I found solace in small victories. Watching my credit score climb back up, paying off the lingering bills that had piled up during the ordeal, and regaining a sense of stability that had felt so out of reach. Each step forward felt like a reclamation of my life, a quiet triumph over the chaos my parents had caused. Still, there were moments when the pain resurfaced, when I found myself longing for the relationship I had once had with my parents. I missed the warmth of family dinners, the easy laughter, the sense of belonging that had once felt so natural. But those moments were fleeting, quickly replaced by the realization that our relationship had never been as solid as I had thought. Their actions had exposed cracks that had been there all along, cracks that couldn't be repaired with a simple apology or a court-ordered restitution payment. I held on to the hope that one day they might truly understand why I had done what I did, not because I wanted an apology or validation, but because I wanted them to grow, to learn from their mistakes, and to become better for it. For now, though, I focused on moving forward. The road ahead wasn't easy, but it was mine to walk. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was walking it on my own terms. With the loan finally removed from my credit report, I could breathe again. It felt like a heavy chain had been lifted off my shoulders, allowing me to take my first steps toward rebuilding my life. But those steps weren't easy. The damage wasn't just financial, it was emotional too. I started with the practical tasks. My credit score, while no longer marred by the fraudulent loan, still bore the scars of late payments and default notices. I became obsessed with fixing it, pouring hours into researching ways to improve my score. I picked up extra shifts at work, funneling every spare penny into paying down my remaining debts. Budgeting became a new way of life. I cut back on anything that wasn't essential. No more takeout dinners, no more impulsive online shopping sprees, no more vacations that strained my savings. It was hard at first, but as the months went by, I began to see the results. Watching my credit score creep higher with each passing month gave me a sense of control I hadn't felt in a long time. But while the financial recovery was straightforward, the emotional fallout was far more complicated. The experience had left me with deep trust issues, not just with my parents, but with people in general. If the two people who were supposed to love and protect me could betray me like that, how could I trust anyone else? I started to reevaluate my relationship with my parents in ways I hadn't before. Growing up, I had always seen them as flawed, but ultimately well-meaning. This experience had shattered that illusion, forcing me to confront the uncomfortable truth. They had chosen their own convenience over my well-being, and they hadn't even tried to take full responsibility for it. That realization wasn't easy to sit with. I found myself cycling through anger, sadness, and a strange sense of numbness as I tried to make sense of it all. But through it, I came to understand something important. I couldn't keep sacrificing my own well-being for the sake of their mistakes. For too long, I had allowed their needs and their crises to take precedence over my own. Whether it was bailing them out of minor financial jams or letting them deflect blame when things went wrong, I had always prioritized keeping the peace over standing up for myself. This time, though, was different. By reporting them and holding them accountable, I had drawn a line in the sand. Though the sting of betrayal lingered, it was outweighed by the strength I felt knowing I had stood up for myself. I had faced an impossible situation and chosen the path that protected my future, even if it came at the cost of my relationship with my parents. That strength became a foundation I leaned on as I worked to reclaim control over my life. Luke was a constant source of support during this time. He reminded me that my worth wasn't tied to my family's approval and that I had every right to prioritize my own well-being. "You didn't betray them," he said one night as we sat on the couch, his arm wrapped around my shoulders. "They betrayed you. Don't let their guilt trips make you forget that." His words gave me the courage to set boundaries I had never set before. When my mom called to ask for help with a minor expense, I calmly but firmly told her no. When my dad tried to guilt me about how the trial had affected their finances, I refused to engage. Each of these moments, small as they seemed, was a step toward reclaiming my power. Beyond my relationship with my parents, the experience also made me reevaluate my other relationships. I became more discerning about who I let into my inner circle, prioritizing people who brought positivity and mutual respect into my life. Friends who had stood by me during the ordeal became even more precious to me, while those who had dismissed my struggles slowly drifted away. As I rebuilt my life piece by piece, I found solace in the lessons the experience had taught me. I learned that boundaries weren't just a luxury, they were a necessity. I learned that loyalty didn't mean enabling bad behavior, and that love wasn't about self-sacrifice at the expense of your own well-being. There were still days when the betrayal felt fresh, when I would catch myself replaying old conversations and wondering if I could have done things differently. But those moments were fewer and farther between as time went on. I began to find joy in the small victories, the satisfaction of checking off another debt payment, the relief of seeing my savings account grow, the peace of knowing I was no longer at the mercy of someone else's mistakes. Each step forward felt like a quiet triumph, a reminder that I was stronger than I had ever realized. Though the scars of the experience would always be with me, they no longer defined me. Instead, they became part of my story, a story of resilience, growth, and the unwavering determination to build a life on my own terms. Years passed, and the chaos of the ordeal began to settle into the background of my life. My relationship with my parents remained strained, but it was no longer a source of constant pain. We spoke occasionally, mostly out of a sense of obligation rather than genuine connection. The conversations were polite but distant, the kind of surface-level exchanges that avoided any mention of what had happened. While the silence on those deeper issues felt like a void, I didn't push for more. I had come to accept that some wounds couldn't be healed with words alone, and trying to force a reconciliation that my parents weren't ready for would only reopen old scars. Despite the tension, I found a way to maintain a functional relationship with them. We exchanged birthday cards and holiday greetings, and I visited them a few times a year. But the closeness we had once shared, the warmth of family dinners and the easy laughter of simpler times, was gone. It had been replaced by a fragile truce, one that required careful navigation to avoid triggering old grievances. Still, I often found myself reflecting on the choices I had made. Could I have handled things differently? Could I have resolved the situation without involving the authorities, without dragging my family through the courts and leaving our relationship in tatters? Those questions lingered in my mind, especially during quiet moments when the weight of everything felt heavier than usual. But each time, I came back to the same conclusion. I had made the right choice. Reporting my parents hadn't been about revenge or punishment. It had been about protecting myself and setting boundaries that they had refused to respect. Their actions had consequences, and as much as it hurt to see them struggle, I knew it wasn't my responsibility to shield them from those consequences. They had made their choices, just as I had made mine. While the experience left deep scars, it also gave me a newfound sense of self-worth. I learned that standing up for myself wasn't selfish. It was necessary. Family might be important, but it didn't give anyone the right to take advantage of me or jeopardize my future. That realization was both liberating and bittersweet. It freed me from the guilt that had weighed me down for so long, but it also forced me to confront the reality of my relationship with my parents. They weren't the infallible figures I had once believed them to be. They were flawed, imperfect people who had made serious mistakes. In the years that followed, I focused on the life I was building for myself. My career flourished, my credit score recovered, and I found joy in the relationships that truly mattered. Luke, my close friends, and the family members who had supported me through it all. There were moments, though, when the past would resurface unexpectedly. A casual comment from a coworker about their parents, a scene in a movie about family conflict, small things that would send me spiraling back into memories of the betrayal and the fallout that followed. But those moments became less frequent as time went on. The pain, once sharp and consuming, dulled into a quiet ache that I carried with me, but no longer let define me. One day, while sorting through old paperwork, I came across the documents from the trial. The bank statements, the forged signatures, the court transcripts. For a moment, I felt a pang of sadness for what had been lost, for the family dynamic that would never be the same. But then, as I held those papers in my hands, I realized how far I had come. The experience hadn't just taught me about boundaries and trust. It had shown me my own strength. It had forced me to confront the uncomfortable truth that sometimes the hardest decisions are the ones that set you free. As I placed the documents back in the folder and tucked them away, I felt a sense of closure I hadn't experienced before. The scars were still there, but they no longer felt like open wounds. They were a part of my story, a reminder of what I had overcome and the lessons I had learned along the way. I didn't know what the future held for my relationship with my parents. Maybe someday we would find a way to rebuild what had been broken. Or maybe we wouldn't. Either way, I knew I would be okay. Because in the end, the experience had given me something I hadn't realized I was missing. A sense of self-worth that didn't depend on anyone else's approval. I had faced betrayal, heartbreak, and doubt, and I had come out the other side stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever to live life on my own terms. And that, I realized, was enough.